stop me if you've heard this before. Hey, I just found this amazing show. You just gotta get through the first bunch of episodes to get to the good stuff. Needless to say, I've been there, and it's been the reason I've watched tons of shows I never enjoyed well into the story, I'm talking like 35 episodes in some cases, that I otherwise would have dropped after the first or second episodes had no one instilled this mantra in me, that I for some reason have to keep watching until it gets to the good part. In the era of Netflix originals, Hollywood blockbusters, YouTube Red, and HBO specials, this notion is even more pervasive than it ever has been, that in order to give a show a fair shot, you're encouraged to, in some cases, watch a significant chunk of the TV show or film in order to truly decide whether or not you actually like or dislike it. And to that I say, no, God! I've genuinely never understood this point of view. The notion that I am somehow being unfair to the creative process or artistic merit of a given piece of media because I don't force myself through the mediocrity in order to get to something worthwhile is at best misguided and at worst damaging to future generations' perception of the creative process. So today I want to explain to you why the first act of a film or the first episode of a TV show is vital. In other words, today I am going to explain how important the first 20 minutes really is. Or should be. As I am sure many of you have already noticed, the first 20 minutes is about enough time for the first act of your story, and about as long as the first episode of a typical televised production. This isn't by accident. The job of this opening 20 minutes worth of scenes is to introduce us all to the plot, setting, themes, and characters of the story. So, what makes for a great scene? Well, Robert McKee describes a scene as being a story in miniature. No matter locations or length, a scene is unified around desire, action, conflict, and change. In other words, a scene can be broken down like a movie can. Meaning, if we assume a film is driven by character, like a lot of superhero films are, ideally within the first 20 minutes of that story, we should expect these scenes that make up that runtime to tell us about who the characters are, and more importantly, who the superhero is. And if they don't achieve what they're trying to do, then the viewer will lose interest. And I just so happen to have the best comparison to help us better understand this concept. I am going to compare the flower shop scene from Tommy Wiseau's The Room to the sandwich shop scene from Spider-Man Homecoming. I know how this looks, but stay with me here. These scenes have tons in common. They're both roughly the same length, being less than 1 minute long, involve the same number of characters, try to achieve the same effects narratively, and feature cuddles with a cute pet. Let's begin. Desire. There's a brief establishing shot of the setting and building Peter is going into. It's a sandwich shop. He must want a sandwich. Just a guess. Action. Peter greets the store owner casually and makes an unconventional sandwich request. Conflict. The sandwich clerk playfully makes a comment about Peter's aunt in Spanish under the assumption that Peter can't understand him. Peter then reveals that he understood the comment by making an equally inappropriate pass at his daughter in Spanish. The clerk, taken aback by this, requests $10 for the sandwich as recompense. Peter insists that he's joking and hands him $5, the original price. Change. Peter receives the sandwich, however now the clerk is aware that he speaks Spanish and knows not to make a pass at his aunt. And he pets the cat! In less than a minute, we learn the nature of Peter's relationship with the store owner, we're shown how smart Peter is, and what he's like when faced with consequences. And that's not even the end of this scene's utility within the entire film. In one of the first action scenes of the movie, Peter saves both this store owner and his cat from a fire. That scene would not have worked if not for this one. The same, however, cannot be said for Tommy Wiseau's The Room. With that said, I have seen The Room 7 times and Spider-Man Homecoming only 3, so there's something to be said about the bizarre train wreck that is Tommy's magnum opus. While this scene has very similar composition to Spider-Man's one, it fails in satisfying this principle. The desire and action is covered, but there is zero conflict. Where Homecoming initiated a small argument between the store owner and Peter to demonstrate aspects of their relationship, The Room just straight up tells us,
"You're my favorite customer. Thanks a lot. Bye. Bye-bye."
Additionally, despite being roughly the same length with the same moving parts while trying to achieve the same thing within the story, it's sort of unfair to compare these two because The Room spends 62% of the scene showing Johnny arriving and leaving in his car.
You are tearing me apart, Lisa!
Despite keeping this concept of scene structure in mind, however, it's still possible to dislike the first episode for a number of reasons. Perhaps it starts off slow. So what keeps the pace up in a story? Well, John York says, a writer's task is to distill the story they're telling by choosing to focus on the important or significant moments. Out of less, they will attempt to capture a whole and present it. This specific principle of storytelling outlines why we don't need to see a character doing mundane tasks and why I can't stand listening to my uncle tell stories.
And the taller fella, though to be fair, there was have no more than an inch in it.
The very first scene of a TV show, comic, or film should be significant and the ideal launching off point for the story, to establish its premise. If the viewer gets the right impression of what a film is about, then they can decide whether or not they will be invested long term or just drop the story entirely. But what's a premise? Well, a premise is the story stated in one sentence. It is the simplest combination of character and plot and typically consists of some event that starts the action. And so, in a way, it's fair to expect the first episode or the beginning of a film to communicate its premise, to show us what we should come to expect from it. The first episode of Attack on Titan shows the walls falling and the main character's life in ruin after. In no uncertain terms, if this episode doesn't catch your interest, then you won't enjoy the story that follows nearly as much as those that did enjoy it. The first episode of The Walking Dead demonstrates the main character navigating the post-apocalyptic world infested with zombies. In this first episode, it establishes the character, setting, and premise of the entire story. If you don't like this first episode of this series, then you're in for a rough ride because it's more of this. This is the benefit of a story starting honestly and strong. The first episode of Pokemon, Friends, One Punch Man, My Hero Academia, and many others demonstrate exactly, in no uncertain terms, what their shows are like right away. And I think it's fair to say that if you don't enjoy any of these first episodes, then you probably won't get anything out of the rest of it. Or at least not to the same degree others who loved it might expect you to. Even YouTube videos to a certain extent, despite their comparatively shorter length, try to start strong and establish themselves early. Take a channel like Film Theory as a prime example of this. Every single episode on that channel begins with a stinger, something that gives the viewer a taste of what's to come later on. One that demonstrates the visual style and the humor more often than not of the media to follow. Not to mention the topic. This isn't by accident, and it's a style adopted from traditional storytelling in films and television. Ensuring that the first 20 minutes is representative of what follows is vital, even if it technically breaks other story conventions to achieve this desired effect. For instance, one of the many lessons to be gleaned from my comparison of the room's flower shop scene and the sandwich shop scene from Spider-Man Homecoming is that if the scene doesn't serve the story, then it can be cut, right? It stands to reason that if you're telling a story, you should only expand upon the aspects that concern the story in the most efficient manner possible. However, we have plenty of examples where that isn't the case at all. One obvious example of this can be seen during Indiana Jones's Raiders of the Lost Ark. When you think about that film's beginning of the story, you think of this scene naturally. I mean, it's possibly the most memorable moment of the entire film. However, that isn't the beginning of the story at all. This is the second scene. We are introduced to certain characters, yes, that play a role in the story later on, but none of the activity that takes place here plays a role in how the story progresses thereafter. Remove this iconic first scene and the story will still make just as much sense as it did before. So why include it? Well, because it represents what's to come much more accurately than this scene does, despite that scene directly beginning the story. It essentially all depends on what aspect of the story you deem to be more important: the plot, setting, theme, or character. And honestly, that's the crux of all of this. What you as an individual deem to be entertaining or interesting could be unique to you. I happen to think that shows like Death Note and Attack on Titan are some of the most captivating and entertaining productions out there. However, that's because I happen to hold plot in very high regard. If someone else were to look at Attack on Titan and their primary focus was, say, character, they might not like it as much as myself. And that's totally fine. TV shows, comics, and films are artistic expression of a given artist, a person. The same way one person cannot guarantee that every single person on the planet will like them, an artist can't guarantee that their show, no matter how well written or how captivating, will entertain everyone. If the opening episode, or if you're being generous, episodes of a show are not capturing your interest, then in all likelihood the show might just not be for you. And much like alcohol, forcing yourself to drink it until you acquire a taste for it is, at least for me, a bit excessive. The entire purpose of the first 20 minutes of any story is to give you a taste, to give you an idea of the direction the story is moving in, to introduce you to the individuals that will accompany you on this journey. And so if you don't enjoy the company, aren't happy with the direction, or maybe the story just isn't capturing your imagination, that should be enough of an indication for you and that friend that keeps pestering you that this story just isn't your speed. And that's what the first episode is designed for. It shows you what the story can become, how sad, how inspirational, and how captivating it can be to you specifically. And thus, that is how powerful, that is how impactful, and that is how important the first 20 minutes of any story really is. Thanks for watching.